What is a parable? Let me remind you what a parable is all about. A parable, as is found in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is simply a short story designed to communicate a spiritual truth. It's either a spiritual truth or a religious principle or a moral lesson. A parable is known as a figure of speech in which the truth of the parable is used by comparison or an example that's drawn from everyday experiences. It was the way that Jesus taught on more occasions than not. And the word parable literally means to throw beside for the purposes of comparison, to put alongside, to take something from everyday life and put it beside that which is the point of the parable, and to teach that spiritual truth then. We have been studying Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we have come to the place in Luke, and we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 15 this morning together. We have looked at all of the parables in Matthew, all of the parables in Mark, and we're getting pretty close to the end of the parables that are found in the book of Luke. There are no parables in the book of John. There's a little different word that is used to describe stories in John, and in fact, in one place in the King James Version in the book of John, you'll find the word parable used, but it's not the Greek word that means to throw beside for purposes of comparison. Perhaps the best way to remember what a parable is to remember that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It is a familiar image that helps to teach a spiritual truth. And Jesus was able to do that so eloquently. His disciples needed interpretation on occasion of the parables. Sometimes the parables were self-evident. And what's very interesting is oftentimes the parables themselves made those who heard the parables upset because they saw the application and they didn't like it. It's a figurative way of teaching divine truth. Now, there are people who say you have to take the Bible literally and everything in the Bible is to be understood literally, and that's simply not true. Parables help to illustrate that. It's a figurative way of teaching divine truth. And the Bible uses several different kinds of figurative teachings to express divine truth. We have the parable in the Bible. There is the proverb. There is the type. There is the allegory. All of those are mentioned by name in the Bible as figures of speech that are used. And we also have the fable used in the Bible to teach, but it's not named. The parable is the oldest and the most common form of figures of speech. And in the Old Testament, there are numerous parables. In fact, Jeff, do you remember, our producer, do you remember us studying the parables of Jeremiah years ago?
Yes,
I thought we had.
but I can't tell you what they were.
I can tell you what they were if I would think about it for a few minutes, but I couldn't remember whether we put them on our program or not. Someday we'll go back and look at those. I've got a lot of questions that you've sent me over the weeks and months that we've been studying parables that we want to take a look at in future episodes, but we want to complete this series. And many writers have endeavored to distinguish the difference between parables and other forms of teachings to help us see it. B.W. Johnson, a Bible commentator that many of you are familiar with, says that a parable differs from a proverb in being a narrative. It differs from the fable in being true to nature. And it differs from the myth in that it's undeceptive, from the allegory in that it veils the spiritual truth. When Jesus taught by parable, the parable was draped in possibility. In fact, many of the parables were either true stories that the people in the area knew about or could have been true. It was something in their everyday life that they could relate to and see the point. There are well over 50 books that I know of that talk about and comment on the parables, and it's difficult to say, as I said at the very beginning of our study, exactly how many parables there are, and the way that you count parables. What you use to categorize them differs from person to person. Usually, it's estimated that there are between 30 to 35. I'm going to conclude with 32 of them in our study together, and